You are listening to the Reality Conference. Do not listen to this book as philosophy. Listen to it as a political file. On the planet called reality, the great powers do not merely fight over money, land, morality, belief, or data. They fight over something beneath all of them, the right to tell human beings what the world is. The state calls it order. The market calls it value. Academia calls it knowledge. The media calls it narrative. Spiritual power calls it light. The algorithm calls it distribution. Each faction draws a map and quietly collects tax from those who live inside it, until someone begins to ask, who drew this map? Each episode is one chapter from a conference that cannot end. And this is today's chapter. Chapter 1, The Room Without Windows. The room had no windows, not because it lacked light. The architects of the neutral zone could easily have opened a pane of glass overlooking the Meaning Basin, where white mist still drifted over the richest depression on the continent of reality. But a window was a political risk. Whoever sat facing the outside would appear closer to the people. Whoever sat with their back to it would appear to have turned away from them. Whoever was allowed to see the horizon would hold a symbolic advantage over those left staring at a wall, so the room was built sealed. The great powers of reality preferred sealed rooms. In places like this, they could speak about the public without having the public look back. At the center of the room stood a large round table, carved from a black wood taken from the edge of the Meaning Basin. No one agreed on what the wood was called. The sacred dominion claimed it once grew around ancient temples, where people had brought their fear of death and exchanged it for a promise of invisible order. Imperia said there was not enough evidence to support that legend. The Federation of Markets had once proposed turning it into a premium material for high-end strategic conference rooms. The sovereign states had asked only one question: who owned the right to harvest it? In the end, the neutral zone kept the remaining timber and made this table. A round table, so no one could sit at the head. A round table, so everyone could pretend to be equal. On its surface was carved the map of the continent of reality, its lines cut thinly into the wood like blade marks on skin. In the north lay the empirical highlands, the cold highlands of the Republic of Imperia. In the south lay the mythic interior, where the sacred dominion built temples, rituals, and roads leading down into the deepest fears of humankind. To the east lay the Market Archipelago, a chain of commercial islands thick with ports, warehouses, exchanges, and cities that knew how to turn lack into product. To the west stretched the Sovereign Belt, a line of laws, borders, fortresses, textbooks, flags, and things collectively known as order. Between those greater regions lay smaller territories, no less dangerous for being smaller. The Academia Republic on its hills of citation, the media straight cutting across the map like a passage of attention, the algorithmic coast running along the eastern shore with its sleepless cities, the identity provinces colored in disputed patches that had never agreed with their own borders, the education corridor running through the center of the continent like a road where every empire wanted to place a checkpoint, Therapy Valley, low and green, where citizens brought their wounds to be named, the moral highlands rising in the southwest, where every road passed through gates of judgment, and the entertainment kingdoms near the sea, glittering with stages, theaters, masks, and buildings no one could quite tell were temples or amusement parks. At the edge of the map was a blank space, the unbounded frontier. Once, that blankness had been nothing more than the humility of cartographers. It meant, this is where our knowledge ends. But in recent months, the blank space had begun to mean something else. It was no longer merely the place no one had mapped. It had become the place where ordinary people had begun to pick up pens of their own. That was why the room was full today. Conference had been called for 9:17 a.m. neutral zone time. On the official calendar, the subject of the session was stabilizing the cognitive environment after recent informational disturbances. No one in the room believed that sentence. They had come because of K, but for the first 30 minutes no one said his name. The powerful have an old superstition. If a thing remains unnamed, perhaps it has not fully entered the room. They were wrong. It had arrived before them. It was in the gray folder placed on the chair's seat. It was in the spread charts not yet projected. It was in the questions people had begun asking in schools, hospitals, temples, offices, therapy rooms, cafes, comment sections, after-school classes, corporate meeting rooms, and in front of phone screens at 2 in the morning. It was in the small irritation of a person about to believe something, then suddenly pausing to ask, who benefits if I call it that? The ambassador of Imperia arrived first. He wore grey, with only a small mark of Method City fastened at the cuff. No jewelry, no excess color, no large symbol. Everything about him was designed to say he had no need for symbols. That, too, was a kind of symbol. 3 assistants followed him. One carried 6 folders. One carried a projection device. The last carried a small case of instruments used to test whether the surface of the table had been altered with reactive material. It has already been checked 3 times, said a neutral zone staff member. Independent checking does not remove the need for rechecking, the ambassador replied. He did not say it as an insult. He said it as though this was the only way a sentence could stand upright. He took the northern seat, directly before the empirical highlands on the map. It was said that seating had been decided by lot. No one believed a coincidence that elegant could survive in a diplomatic room. The second to enter was the Minister of the Sovereign States of Order. He did not come alone. With him were 3 security officers, a legal advisor, and a man who was never introduced, though everyone understood he represented crisis control. The minister stood at the door longer than necessary, looking at the exits, the ceiling, the narrow seams in the walls, the distance between chair and table, before finally stepping inside. The neutral zone should review its security protocols, he said. The ambassador of Imperia did not look up from his inspection notes. The current protocols have been certified by 3 independent assessment groups. Assessment is not a substitute for control, the minister replied. Imperia wrote something down, no one knew what. The minister sat to the west, before the sovereign belt. He placed both hands on the table. He did not touch the map, but he was close enough for everyone to see that he could. The chief executive of the Federation of Markets arrived a few minutes later. He wore a suit formal enough not to seem careless, soft enough not to look rigid like sovereign. He carried no heavy folder. He carried a thin tablet, a smile refined across many rounds of funding negotiations, and an assistant whose job was to record every phrase that might one day become a product. Apologies for arriving so close to the hour, he said. The route from the market archipelago through the media strait was rather congested this morning. It seems everyone wants to arrive before this story becomes a full-scale crisis. This story is already a crisis, said Sovereign. Markets took his seat to the east before his archipelago. Crisis, he repeated, as if testing the weight of the word in his hand, can also be an opportunity for restructuring. Imperia did not look up. A very convenient way to speak when one intends to sell the new structure. Markets smiled. And a very convenient way to speak when one intends to preserve the old structure by requesting more evidence. Sovereign looked at both of them. We are not here today to perform intelligence. No one answered, but a small truth had been placed on the table. No faction hated the others enough to not need them. The door opened again. The spiritual head of the sacred dominion entered. He walked slowly, carrying no documents, no device, no assistant. In his hand was a string of dark beads. His robe was the color of earth, bearing no obvious religious emblem, only thin lines of embroidery at the cuffs. He did not look at the map immediately. He looked at each person in the room as though the true map were not on the table, but behind their eyes. Have you come to protect reality, he asked, or to protect the portion of reality you have already named? Markets tilted his head, amused. Imperia finally looked up. Is that a rhetorical question or a proposition requiring analysis? Sacred smiled. For some people, a question exists only after it has been licensed by method. For others, method begins only when the question remains alive. We have not begun the session, Sovereign said. No. Sacred replied, taking his seat in the south. The session began before we entered the room. Only now have you agreed to listen to its echo. The rector of the Academia Republic entered soon after, carrying a small stack of books and a thick packet of marked pages. She had the face of someone long accustomed to answering no question before first asking which tradition the question belonged to. She set the books down, looked over the map, and let her eyes rest on the blank space of the unbounded frontier longer than the previous delegates had. "We are facing a problem of classification," she said. Sovereign answered at once. "No, we are facing a problem of stability." Imperia said, "We are facing a problem of verification." Markets said, "We are facing a problem of value distribution." Sacred said, "We are facing a problem of a lost soul." The rector of academia pulled out her chair. "Exactly, one phenomenon, 5 attempts at territorial claim, that is why we must meet." No one greeted her, everyone listened. The editor-in-chief of the media straight entered, as though he had never been entirely absent. He wore a dark coat and carried a small notebook. Behind him came 2 image officers. Neutral zone staff immediately stopped them, reminding them that recording was not permitted in the conference. The editor-in-chief raised both hands. "Of course, no recording, only observation." "Observation is also a form of intervention," academia said. "Not observing is an even worse intervention," media replied. "What is not narrated is often treated as though it never happened. Or what is narrated badly outlives what actually happened," Imperia said. Media turned to him. "That is why you need us. Truth does not walk into the public mind by itself. And you often break its legs before carrying it in," Imperia replied. Markets let out a small laugh. Sacred closed his eyes, as if listening to children quarrel at the foot of a temple. The representative of the algorithmic coast arrived last. No one heard the door open. After a while, everyone simply realized that someone was already seated in the northeastern chair, near the boundary between the media strait and the algorithmic coast. The representative wore plain black, with no symbol, no papers, no assistant. In front of them lay only a thin device like a dark pane of glass. Sovereign immediately asked, "Is that device recording?" The representative of the algorithmic coast looked at him. "It is listening. What is the difference? Recording stores sound, listening analyzes signal." The room fell silent. Media wrote quickly in his notebook. Imperia leaned forward. "Have you just admitted that the device is processing data in a closed meeting?" Algorithmic Coast replied, "No, I have just admitted that every meeting produces data. The only question is who has the right to call it data." The atmosphere shifted slightly. It was not the silence of insult. It was the silence of a sentence reaching the core of the issue too early. After Algorithmic Coast came the smaller representatives, though smaller did not mean less dangerous. The envoy from the Identity Provinces wore a jacket sewn with many colored threads running parallel before splitting apart, like borders that had never settled. The delegate from Therapy Valley entered with a voice so soft that listeners had to remind themselves softness did not mean weakness. The Lord of the Moral Highlands wore no uniform, no crown, only a small burning scale insignia at the collar. The observer from the education corridor was a middle-aged teacher, carrying the tired expression of someone who had watched too many generations of students pass through doors called the future. The representative of the entertainment kingdoms came last among them, wearing a ring shaped like a mask, with eyes that seemed to have seen every tragedy as a script. Once they were all seated, the room felt more sealed than before, though no additional door had closed. The chair of the neutral zone was an old man who represented no nation. His place was between the directions, at the point on the map that belonged to no country and was visible to all. He waited for the murmurs to fade, then placed his hand on the gray folder. "The conference begins at 9:17, he said. "Official subject, stabilizing the cognitive environment after recent informational disturbances." The media straight gave a faint laugh, a very gentle title. Sovereign looked at him, "Because this is a record, not a headline." The chair continued without reacting. "Practical subject, reviewing the texts signed by K that have circulated over the past 6 months, assessing their impact on cognitive territories, and determining a common response should one be necessary." For the first time, K's name was spoken in the room. There was no thunder, no door flew open. No supernatural event occurred, unless one counted the fact that several people looked, at the same moment, toward the empty chair positioned between the education corridor and the unbounded frontier. The chair had no nameplate. No one asked why it was there. In diplomacy, some questions are so dangerous that everyone agrees to pretend they do not exist. The chair opened the folder. The first foundational document is the brief text believed to have initiated the original spread. It consists of one sentence. He paused. Whether they wished to or not, the room waited. The chair read, "Before you believe a definition, ask who has the right to collect tax from it." No one spoke at once, not because the sentence was difficult to understand. On the contrary, it was too easy to understand. That was the problem. A sentence short enough for ordinary people to remember, sharp enough for them to use, open enough to slip into any context, offensive enough to force authorities to react, simple enough not to be immediately imprisoned in academia's terminology, irritating enough for media to be unable to ignore it, dangerous enough for sovereign to call it instability, sellable enough for markets to begin imagining a toolkit, close enough to a religious question for sacred not to dismiss it entirely, relevant enough to attention, data, and distribution for algorithmic coast to understand that this was no longer merely an essay. It was an operation. Imperia spoke first. "This is a proposition that has not been sufficiently verified. It has high cognitive stimulation value, but it risks reducing every definition to a mechanism of extraction." Sacred turned the beads in his hand. "And if many definitions truly do contain mechanisms of extraction," Markets said, "the question is not whether it is absolutely true or false. The question is why it spreads." Academia gently corrected him. "No. The prior question is, what do we mean by spread? Does it spread as a slogan, a concept, a tool, or a symptom?" Media replied, "To the public, that distinction often does not matter." Academia looked at him. "Because your institutions have trained them to think it does not matter." Moral Highlands spoke. "This sentence carries an ethical danger. If every belief is interrogated for who collects tax from it, society will lose its foundation of trust." Identity provinces leaned forward. "There are foundations of trust built by forbidding certain people to ask questions." Sovereign cut in. "We are not here to conduct a collective confession." "No," Entertainment said for the first time, "we are here to decide who will rewrite that confession into a communique." Several eyes turned toward him. He only smiled. The chair raised a hand. "Algorithmic coast, present the spread report." The surface of the table lit up. Not the whole map. Only a small point near the edge of the education corridor. From that point, thin lines of light spread outward like veins. They ran through the media straight, leapt to the market archipelago, rebounded toward the Academia Republic, touched Therapy Valley, slid down into the Sacred Dominion, then curved back toward the Moral Highlands. After that, the lines no longer followed national borders. They moved beneath them. Algorithmic Coast said, "In the first 3 weeks, the phrase cognitive tax was statistically negligible in public data. After the text signed by K, the phrase began to rise in branching form. What matters is not the initial speed of spread, but its capacity to generate variance." Small phrases appeared across the map: tax of attention, tax of belief, tax of shame, tax of hope, tax of data, tax of suffering, tax of the future, tax of definition. Markets leaned forward slightly. "Variant generation suggests usability." Sovereign looked at him. "You always see the product before the fire." Markets replied, "Because many fires are put out by the right product at the right time." Imperia said, "Or started in order to sell extinguishers." Markets looked at him. The smile remained, but his eyes cooled. "I hope the Republic of Imperia applies the same evidentiary standards to its metaphors." The chair did not let them move further. Continue the report. Algorithmic Coast enlarged the education corridor. The light there was thicker. "The concept has spread most strongly among students, young knowledge workers, creative communities, parts of the therapy public, certain identity-based groups, and communities debating AI. Of particular interest, in the education corridor, a new behavior has emerged. Learners are beginning to ask about the origin of standards before attempting to meet them." The observer from the education corridor, almost silent until now, lifted his head. "I am not certain that is a bad thing." Sovereign turned toward him. "Teacher, with all respect, if every student asks where a standard comes from before learning, the system will slow down." The teacher replied, "Perhaps the system slows down because it has been moving too fast on a road no one asked the destination of." Markets said, The labor market will not wait for them to complete their cognitive crisis. Therapy Valley spoke gently. Nor should the labor market be the only god deciding how long children are allowed to be in crisis. Imperia added, the question of a standard's origin is valid, so long as it does not become the rejection of all standards. Sacred said, young people without a ground beneath them will mistake suspicion for freedom. Identity replied, and young people with too many grounds built by others will mistake obedience for maturity. The first cord was pulled tight. The chair looked down at the folder, then placed a new cover document on the table. We will not debate the entire phenomenon at once. According to the agenda, this session will review each of the major circulated texts. Each text will be treated as an exhibit. After each exhibit, the parties will assess its impact on their territories. Media Straight asked, how many exhibits? 7 primary exhibits, the chair replied, and several appendices. Academia asked, criteria for selection, reach of circulation, degree of variant generation, number of affected territories, and reactions from the relevant powers. Imperia nodded slightly, at least the structure sounded acceptable. The chair placed his hand on the first file. Exhibit A. On the table, the education corridor began to glow faintly. The teacher saw it. He said nothing, but beneath the table, his hand tightened. The chair read the title of the file. Does a university degree matter? Markets smiled like a man hearing the name of a familiar mining region. Sovereign sat straighter. Academia adjusted her glasses. Imperia uncapped his pen. Media wrote down a provisional headline. The education corridor looked down at the map, where the long passage through the center of reality glowed like a road just discovered not to lead where it had always promised. At the edge of the map, the unbounded frontier did not glow. It merely changed color, as though it were waiting. The chair opened the first page of Exhibit A. The real session began.